Investments in Vietnam in 2022. Avoiding legal conflicts. This is our topic for today as part of the series Global Business Law in 20 Minutes with Federico Vasoli.
Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast by InstantMediations.com, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube, the Instant Mediations app, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent.
Hello and welcome. My name is Natalia Łowska-Czajka. I am an advocate, mediator, and arbitrator from Warsaw, Poland.
And hi, this is Mac Pierre-Louis again, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator working throughout the states of Florida and Texas.
Federico Vasoli, Italian lawyer with offices in Malta, Singapore, and Vietnam, where I have been working for many years.
Thanks so much, Federico. Okay, guys, so we're back, and this time we're segueing to focus on one country in particular, and that is Vietnam. In a first episode we had done for this new year, 2022, we were looking back in the past as it relates to Vietnam, Malta, and Singapore, the three countries that Federico works in, and we were doing some takeaways from 2021. Now that we are in the beginning of 2022, we have Federico back to discuss some conflict issues that come up when you're dealing with investments in Vietnam. So this is particularly focused on business investments, and in light of a country that is still grappling with COVID travel issues, COVID immigration issues, COVID lockdowns, vaccine issues. And because things are so fluid and changing, we always want to give good insights from somebody in the field who knows what they're talking about. And so, Federico, one thing that I was mentioning to you and Natalia before we started recording was that markets need certainty, okay? For any market to function well and to provide good returns on investment, you have to have stability and lack of chaos. And so, why don't you explain to us, how does COVID-induced uncertainty in Vietnam cause conflicts in investment? But the ground is yours. Go ahead and introduce it as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Mac. Well, I hope I know what I'm talking about, but yes, I have been exposed to Vietnam for many years now, business-wise, and also personally. The first time I set foot in Vietnam was in 2005, and I opened my first office in 2007. Actually, it was almost 2008. So I've been spending a lot of time there. With COVID, to answer your question, there's not so much certainty in Vietnam. Vietnam is a country. The Vietnamese people tend to be very abrupt and sudden in their decisions. They are, I don't want to generalize, but I'll do it. As a broad generalization, the Vietnamese tend to be prudent, like most Asians. But then there is a degree of their personality which is not so adverse to risk. And that translates into political decisions that are taken really abruptly. We saw that with the government in the hardest phase of the pandemic in the summer 2021. Government or local governments announced the shutting down of certain services within hours. For instance, it happened to me that I had to deliver some documents through a service in Vietnam where essentially you use a motorbike. You know that in Vietnam, for those of you that haven't been to Vietnam, you may know that in Vietnam, the main way to travel across cities is a scooter, a moped. So even goods, documents, etc., travel on two wheels. And I was in lockdown, and I had to send some documents from my home to my office. Unfortunately, those delivery services were shut down in a matter of just a few hours. So luckily, a colleague of mine that was already vaccinated was allowed to travel throughout the city in Hanoi, and delivered those documents for me. Otherwise, it would have been lost. So no, to answer your question, there is not so much stability when it comes to decisions related to COVID, but the leitmotif is prudence. So before they open up entirely, they will wait more than we have waited in Europe, when already in 2020, without the vaccines available in the summertime, we thought that COVID was kind of over. On the other hand, Vietnam needs foreign investments. And in fact, in 2020, the government approved the two main pillar laws that regulate foreign investments, and also local investments. Actually, they regulate investments in general, including foreign ones, namely the law on investments and the law on enterprises, with the wish to attract more and more investments in the country in 2021. That, of course, did not materialize because COVID, and also because the government indeed took this very harsh approach in the hope of curbing the pandemic in the summer of 2021. So let me just add something more. I would like to give a bit of background, because not many people know Vietnam, even though it is a more and more popular business destination. Vietnam has been growing remarkably. Vietnam is a huge success story. Its growth rate is second only to China's. It's come out of extreme poverty in a matter of probably 2 decades only. So it is a success story. It is a place where foreigners can make a lot of money, where you can enjoy your life, where things function. There is energy, there is also a sense of beauty, etc. And also, the pandemic in 2020 showed that global business cannot rely on one single supplier, namely China. But it could be true with any other country. I'm not pointing fingers at China necessarily. But having alternative sources, like Vietnam, is a very wise thing to do. So in 2020, they passed these laws that were enforced in 2021 in the hope of attracting investments. However, as I said, this is not really materialized. Vietnam is not a first world country yet, so it still has to grapple with typical inefficiencies that are common in these emerging economies, including these sudden decisions. But this is basically to wrap things up before we go into the conflict phase.
Yeah, and now into the meat of our conversation. We are discussing today how to avoid legal conflicts within the business environment in Vietnam 2022. What do you think, Federico? Where would those legal conflicts mainly come from?
When it comes to investments, there are, I would say, at least 2 aspects to take into account. One is contradictions within the laws themselves. And I'll give you an example. Those of you that are familiar with doing business with Asia, the Asia Pacific, know that in most Asia Pacific countries, on top of signing documents, legal documents, you also need to stamp them. The stamp is fundamental. In Europe, we're not really used to stamps. It's kind of a beauty thing. It's an ornamental thing that you use. But in certain Asian countries, namely Vietnam, they're really fundamental. However, in 2022, but even in 2020, it was perhaps a bit too late with so much technology governing our lives to have to require business people to print hard copies of documents and have them signed and stamped. Also because it's not really a safe way to preserve original documents. So the requirement of having certain stamps for businesses in Vietnam, including international ones, was removed with the new laws. Nevertheless, other very relevant laws, for instance, those governing taxes, still require you to use the good old stamps. So if one law requires you to have the stamp and the other doesn't, what do? You still use the stamp. This is one example. Then there could be the other aspect that could generate conflicts is certain fine definitions that you will find in the law. For instance, one notable change in the law on investments was that the threshold to define a foreign investment enterprise has been lowered from 51% to 50% only. But how do you define exactly this figure? That is, 51% is clearer in my view. So the interpretation of the law can give way to conflicts. Concrete procedures can create conflicts. The new laws still do not address, for instance, the minimum capitalization of most types of companies. Let me rephrase this. In regulated industries such as banking, insurance, etc., there is a minimum share capital for companies that are established in Vietnam. However, for the vast majority of businesses, there is no such requirement. So in theory, you would be able to set up a company with 1 Vietnam dong, which is worth nothing, share capital. However, since local authorities still have to vet investments, it is advisable to have a minimum share capital that is proportional to the size of the investment that you're going to make. And that is usually never below the equivalent of, I would say, bare minimum $40,000, if not more, which is, of course, much more expensive than in terms of actual cash flow than doing business in other countries. For instance, in Singapore, which is very expensive, with just 1 Singapore dollar, you have a company. Then you may have reputational issues, then you may have problems with banks, with potential investors, etc. But that's a different story. Legally, with $1, you do it, unless you are in a regulated industry. So I would see these things. And of course, the other aspect is that foreigners need to be aware of what they need to know in order to do business in Vietnam. I said it in a very complicated way. But essentially, if you don't know that you need to meet certain requirements, then the moment you start doing business, you can be fined. Your investment could be invalid. We talked about it in the episodes about contracts. There can be some formalities that, if not met, render the contract null and void. And the same applies to investments, not just to contracts. And most investors do not know, they're not aware of these. And this is why we do this job. We essentially tell them what to watch out for and how to try and avoid and eventually solve conflicts.
Thank you. So, what does the future hold when it comes to the signs that the Vietnamese government is, putting out? In your opinion, what does the next 6 months look like?
If the pandemic doesn't hit back too severely, it would be the right time to invest in Vietnam. Not necessarily because the future is super bright, but because it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Vietnam really placed itself on the map in 2020 as an alternative to China, in addition to China, especially for manufacturing, but not just for manufacturing. For coding, for marketing, for many other things. One of probably Vietnam's greatest assets is its people. Seriously, the Vietnamese are young, energetic. They like to study. Of course, I'm generalizing people who are not so bright and nice, but a lot of companies have been outsourcing to Vietnam certain tasks that were perhaps centralized before in more expensive jurisdictions such as Singapore, that has made it more difficult to, as we said in a previous episode, to hire foreign workers, and even more expensive, of course. So I think that the future is bright in the short run. The big question mark that I have about Vietnam is its value proposition. That is, provided that you are in the area that until before the pandemic was growing the most in the world, with probably the highest number of potential consumers. You have China at your doorsteps, you have India not so far away, you have Japan, you have South Korea, you have Southeast Asia, you have Singapore, etc. So provided that all these things are still there, if the value proposition is simply to provide low-cost manufacturing like China did in the late 70s, early 80s, and 90s, that may be a bit short-sighted. Still, this is already being addressed in that, for instance, the largest employer in Vietnam is Samsung, the Korean tech giant, that gives jobs to probably 100,000 people in the country. So Vietnam is trying to diversify its value proposition by becoming also a high-level manufacturing hub for high-tech goods, for the automotive industry also, and other crucial sectors. They are also implementing new laws to protect the environment, which is crucial in Vietnam. They are passing new laws for on data protection. So that is what I see in the long run. However, there could be stumbling blocks ahead.
And when we are talking about investment, business, conflict, I think that what is really also playing a huge role is always government. And are you aware of any government signals that can be like traffic lights for what to expect, how to go through things? You already said that there might be those conflicting laws. And what is then the government suggesting in terms of that? Any proposed laws, any interpretation that they would want to, any other solutions? And one more thing, back to what Mac was saying at the very beginning of this episode. I understand that Vietnam was able to create laws throughout the pandemic in a very speedy and effective way, sometimes pretty surprising. So you are being optimistic about it, and don't you see a threat in the sudden changes of law, or do government assurances give enough protection as to being sure that not an unpleasant surprise can really meet an investor?
Well, yes, I have mixed feelings about what you just said, Natalia. That is, in my experience, dealing with the public administration, so the government in a broader sense, not the executive branch, in Vietnam can be a painful exercise. But in my personal experience, it's been pretty smooth. For instance, as a lawyer, I have seen the liquidation or closure of companies, representative offices, branch offices in Vietnam. And whilst it is relatively easy to invest in Vietnam because they welcome you and they want you to set foot in the country, it is not so easy to leave. It's not so easy to close down a company, for instance, or a branch office because of legal procedures, because of regulatory procedures, rather. So that is the difficult part. I do agree with you that sudden changes in legislation can hurt the economy and the investment climate. Yet these changes generally favor investments and not the other way around. The only aspect where I have seen sudden changes that hurt investments was in the field of curbing the pandemic, so not allowing foreigners to go to Vietnam, for instance, or making it really difficult for them to go to Vietnam for business. And those decisions were taken quickly. The other thing that may cast a sinister shadow on the topics that you discussed is the fact that the new laws allow the governments or the local governments interference with business when businesses are not operating smoothly and properly. There are certain conditions when, for instance, a company is dormant, the directors have disappeared, the shareholders are nowhere to be found, the share capital has diminished drastically, and so on and so forth, then the government intervenes in managing the company and perhaps in closing it down. Now, this is relatively common also in other jurisdictions. In Malta and Singapore, it is for the company registry to strike off a company after a certain number of years. The worry could be that the interpretation of this power that the government is vested with could be too favorable for the government and not so much for foreign investors. But I think it's kind of a remote instance. In general, Vietnam welcomes foreign investments that are, by the way, protected if they come from certain parts of the world. What do I mean by that? Vietnam has signed a number of free trade agreements with many countries. The most notable one is probably the one with the European Union. but there's a similar one with the UK. I'm not sure about the US, but America really sees Vietnam as a strategic place for business in Southeast Asia, also for geopolitical reasons, because it would mean joining forces with Japan and South Korea that are already investing heavily in Vietnam. And, if you have Japan and South Korea and Vietnam by your side, from an American perspective, you're somehow containing China. And the Vietnamese generally are happy with that, by the way. So the free trade agreement between the EU and Vietnam is complemented by an investment protection agreement that is modeled after the one that was signed between Singapore and the European Union. So it's a good one, it's a good standard, which means that European invested companies in Vietnam cannot be so easily expropriated, nationalized, etc. And that is likely true. I didn't read the agreement between the UK and Vietnam, but I'm sure that there are similar agreements with many other jurisdictions that safeguard the investments made by foreigners in the country.
Thank you, Federico. Okay, so we're wrapping it up now, but there's so much that can be said about what the future holds. The only thing is, nobody knows. And so it's always good to just take time and, banter about some predictions that we might have. So we appreciate your insights and your thoughts, and we will see in 6 months, what was correct. But as usual, thanks so much. And we look forward to talking to you some more on the next episode.
Thank
See
you all.
you and bye.